Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Laura Hulthen Thomas. Laura is an award-winning author, essayist, and head of the undergraduate creative writing program at the University of Michigan's Residential College. Her work has appeared in Witness, Epiphany, Summerset Review, failbetter, the tÄmz Review, the Cimarron Review, and elsewhere. We're excited to be with her today. First-time listeners, welcome. We're glad you're here. We're building a community of writers and artists from all walks of life, and since you're with us on this journey, we'd appreciate if you would like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and spread the word. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover, or a guest you want us to bring on, please let us know, and for more free resources, check out the Date Keepers blog at thedatekeepers.com/blog. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you. Can you please tell us about you and your work?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast. My name is Laura Hulthen Thomas. I teach fiction and nonfiction writing at the Residential College at the University of Michigan. The Residential College is a small living learning community at the university. And before becoming a teacher, I held a number of clerical and service jobs, everything from working in a group home for the elderly to inspecting wire harnesses for a car company to being a bookkeeper in an architectural firm. And all of these jobs, and including my teaching job, have just taught me how to be a better writer, how to look for stories in people's work, their experience of customer service, learning from the general public, learning from the people you meet at work, and especially how characters' jobs bleed into their family lives, both for the good and, of course, to stoke a little bit of conflict in their home lives. So I've taken a lot of inspiration from all the jobs I've had, especially in crafting my first novel, The Meaning of Fear. I've written a short story collection, which was published in 2016, and I have another novel forthcoming in June 2027.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. And
thank you.
Can you talk more about your short story collection and what did you learn while navigating the publishing world?
Yes, I learned a lot. So the States of Motion is the name of that collection, and I published it with a university publisher, Wayne State University Press, which is a fantastic publisher based in Detroit, Michigan, obviously associated with Wayne State University. Had a fabulous editor there, wonderful experience all around with the first publication. They were very generous towards my work, sharp editing eye, lots of support for the publishing process. I especially enjoyed working with Wayne State because my stories are very character-driven. They take deep dives into people's marriages, into being parents, and especially into complicated family dynamics, as well as I said, intersecting with people's jobs, often blue-collar jobs, but some, white-collar jobs as well. And so my characters tend to be messy, and they tend to make messes for themselves. And so I felt that Wayne State really got that. They got that my characters have a range of emotions and behaviors, some of which they're very proud of and some of which these characters are not so proud of. So it's the messiness and complication of life that Wayne State really supported. And they are also publishers of fiction set in Michigan specifically. And so they were very supportive of the ways I was portraying a place that isn't often depicted in fiction, which is Southeast Michigan, semi-rural, I guess, is what you would call a township in Michigan, which is where a lot of my fiction takes place. And so you've got some suburbs that are, fairly working class. You've got some suburbs that are fairly upper class. And then you've got farmland, all sometimes within the same square mile or even less. So it's a place that is situated outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, which of course is a liberal stronghold. And the surrounding areas can be very conservative. So there's a lot of excitement in these places. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of intersection with nature. And Wayne State was just very supportive of the ways I was exploring those themes.
And what, in your opinion, makes a good story collection? What's your philosophy of what a story collection should be?
That's a good question, and I think it's really dependent, as most things are with writing, on the work itself. I tried to sell a short story collection before States of Motion was accepted that had thematic unity, but did not have place unity. And that was not a good sell. So I would say what I learned from publishing States of Motion and the editing process was the unity of the collection has many parts to it. It isn't necessarily that characters need to be shared. It isn't necessarily that the stories have to be similar, but the ties between the stories need to make sense on more than just one level. So, for example, I keep coming back to place, the types of situations people find themselves in, the types of conflict that characters are creating for themselves or stumbling into, and just some unity with the characters' outlook and worldview. My characters are not the same people story to story, but they have commonalities in terms of, I guess, shared experiences and shared reactions to situations. Or in the case of my short story collection, you might have similar situations in different stories that characters respond to in the complete opposite way. So it's hard to put your finger on. That's just my experience of what I learned from my short story collection. I think another writer would definitely, and an editor might have a different answer for that.
Did you get feedback on that first collection that gave you a sense of why it wasn't selling, or did you have to infer that by comparing it to the collection that did sell?
That's also a very good question. I sent it to quite a few publishers, and as we all experience as writers, the rejections I was getting were pretty pro forma. I didn't learn a lot. I'm old enough that back in the day, we used to get handwritten notes sometimes from editors, and they might say a word or two about what wasn't working for them. By the time I was trying to publish this short story collection, it was electronic submissions mostly at that point, if not exclusively. And the rejections were pretty pro forma. So I wasn't getting a lot of feedback from the rejection process. I had my close writer friends read it and give me some feedback, of course. And I think the big break for me was that I submitted the collection to Wayne State, and the editor was kind enough there to call me and say, I need to reject this, and this is why. And she ran down all of the reasons why this collection was not ready for prime time. And she gave me some very specific feedback. It was a complete courtesy on her part. She was very generous with me. I think she made that outreach because I was a Michigan author, because she could tell that I had put a lot of time and care into the work. And I felt like that was the rejection of a lifetime because I got an editor to tell me their take on it. And I took that feedback and crafted a different approach, took out the stories that were not working, created more unity between the stories, certainly in terms of place, and also wrote some new stories to fill some gaps that she identified. And when I resubmitted it, she accepted it. So I think writers have lucky breaks, and that was my lucky break.
I also think that finding good editors is very, very important. And a lot of writers, just want to find an editor. And we always try to encourage people to look for an editor who will invest in their work and make it like their own. But I am curious, why did you choose to pursue publication on your own without an agent?
Yes. So with the short story collection, I knew that it was very unlikely to attract an agent's attention. To be honest with you, I cannot remember if I ever submitted the short story collection to an agent. Maybe I did early on, and I got rejections. And I thought, it's a short story collection. This is just not the road for this work. Because they're short stories, and because my stories also read like mini novels, they're quite long. They're not your typical short stories. They go pretty deep into character and psychology and emotions. And I felt that small presses were really going to be a friendlier audience for the collection. And then I ended up placing with Wayne State. And with my novel, it was a very similar decision. I submitted The Meaning of Fear to a number of agents first, and when the rejections came in, some of them very, very positive with some very meaningful feedback. But I did make a decision to stop querying agents with this novel because the changes that were being suggested were not ones that I felt were right for this novel. I wanted the novel to say certain things that would be harder to sell on the level of the big five, let's just say. And so, because of my wanting to be the novel a certain way and to reflect my vision for that novel, I made the conscious decision to then submit to small presses and ended up placing it with a traditional small press. And that was a great decision for me. When I talk to my students at the university level about publishing, this is one of their number one questions is, do I need an agent? And do you have an agent? And I explained to them my journey and why I decided not to go that route ultimately. Doesn't mean that I wouldn't with another book in the future. Right now, the work is a better fit for a small press. And I encourage my students to really think about what kind of writer they want to be. And if they want to be a writer who lands an agent, they probably need to have a little bit more of a vision of the commercial market than I'm able to have with certain of my works. And certainly if they're writing genre fiction, it's a little bit easier to decide to go with an agent, I believe. And if they want to have a little bit more control over the subject matter, control over the editorial process, and just write with fewer commercial criteria in mind, then I think a small press pathway is right. And I'll just say lastly that I firmly believe that writers change through the course of their career. And I think you really do need to be guided. I mean, I certainly have by the work that's before me with my short story collection, with my novels. I just knew that small presses were just going to be a better fit. I may write something in the future where I think, I think an agent might be interested in this. The jury's out on that. We'll see. But I think the work really demands the path forward, and that path can change during the course of your career.
And what was it about that novel and your vision for it that you felt wouldn't jive with the commercial constraints you would be under if you were trying to publish with the big five?
It's structurally a little bit of a different approach. There's an alternating point of view between a character named Leah Johnson, who's a behavioral researcher, and then a cop who's a deputy sheriff in a township in semi-rural Michigan, southeast Michigan. And they trade point of views. That's not non-traditional. Of course, many novels trade these points of view. However, their voices they go deep. They perseverate. They really think things through. They have high levels of, you know, self-doubt, and they're struggling with experiences of long-term trauma. Both characters are. And I felt that in order to get at the heart of these characters, I needed to address and get at the heart of the traumas that they're carrying. And for the purposes of this novel, I wanted to be very direct about those traumas. In Leah's case, there was a childhood assault by a family friend. And in Paul Rilke's case, the cop, he had a very problematic and abusive relationship with an alcoholic father. And I wanted to not turn a misty eye on the theme of trauma in this novel. I wanted to explore, I wanted to be direct. And that's kind of direct psychological and emotional unpacking of that particular subject matter, I think is hard for some agents and for some publishers to want to market on a commercial scale.
Can you tell us about your second novel? What is it about and the process of writing it? What was it like?
Yes. Yeah. So that one's called Women Aren't Funny. And I started writing that after I finished The Meaning of Fear. The Meaning of Fear is very, it has dark humor in it and moments of actual humor, but it was also a heavy lift to write. And I needed something a little bit more fun, or what passes for fun in my writer's mind, which is still a little bit of dark, dry humor. So I started Women Aren't Funny as just sort of a fun respite before I started another real serious novel project. And the more I spent time with the characters, the more they just grew on me. And so I just wrote a novel. And it's a shorter novel than The Meaning of Fear. And it follows the stories of 4 different three women and one teenage young woman as they're navigating a increasingly polarized and very strange community in the aftermath of the 2016 election. So the action takes place again in a fictional township right outside a very liberal town. And so some of the folks who would be happy with the outcome of that election are in the story, and some of the folks who would not be very happy with that election are represented in the story. And these women are navigating increasingly absurd changes to their communities as a result of this sort of political divide that became very acute at that time, and also dealing with family tragedies with their coping skills, let's just say, eroding very quickly based on many factors in their community and in their families. And I'll say that it was also inspired by a quote from Christopher Hitchens, the famous one about, humor being, I don't have the quote in front of me, I'm so sorry, and I don't have my manuscript in front of me either. So it's paraphrasing Christopher Hitchens, but saying that women can't be funny because humor is essentially aggression, and only men can really be aggressive in that way, and therefore women can't be funny. And at the time, I just laughed at that, and I thought Christopher Hitchens has clearly never met aggressive women. So I decided to write a novel about some aggressive and I hope funny women.
So now, apart from Christopher Hitchens, who would you consider to be your literary influences?
Well, I'll say Christopher Hitchens is not a literary influence. Let's just say that right off the bat. Although, thank you for that terrible sexist quote that gave me the idea for this novel. So, like a lot of writers, that's a hard question to answer. I read a lot, of course. I teach a lot of different books and short stories. So, just a few that I can throw out that I come back to quite a bit are, ZZ Packer's short stories are absolute gems. I teach those and reread those all the time. Her collection, Drinking Coffee Elsewhere, is just amazing. I just can't say enough about her work. At the time I started drafting The Meaning of Fear, I was reading a lot of Andrea Barrett's work because her short stories and then her novel, The Voyage of the Narwhal, goes deep into character and character motivations and psychology. And her characters are also driven by scientific hunger, the drive to find out something about the natural world, both in female and male characters. And her stories often take place around the turn of the 20th century when women in science were not so much a thing. And these characters are often driven by kind of an obsessive desire to find out more about the natural world in order to answer questions within the characters themselves. So that was a big inspiration for me for my character of Leah Johnson in The Meaning of Fear. Other influences are, I love Dom DeLillo, White Noise, just that absurdist, over-the-top type of writing. A more recent read for me is the work of Charlotte Wood. The Natural Way of Things is a terrific novel that tells about these 10 women who wake up and find they've been kidnapped to the wilds of the Australian outback, and they have no idea what's going on, and they're just imprisoned, and all their nice clothes have been taken away. They're all sort of middle class, upper middle class folks. And they come to realize that they recognize each other because they've all been on television or in the media for being Me Too survivors. And so the forces that be have kidnapped them and brought them to this remote place to really punish them for being survivors. And it's a wild novel. Literally, it's out in the wilds. It's unlike anything you'll ever read. So I find that enormously inspiring.
We always ask our guests to read a portion from their work. Would you like to read something for us?
That would be great. Thank you for asking me to do that. I'm going to read from my forthcoming novel, The Meaning of Fear, and I'll just read a brief scene. Going to take it up mid-scene. This is early in the novel when Leah Johnson comes home from her workday at a lab at the University of Michigan. She's a behavioral researcher. She does animal researcher. Her marriage is on the rocks because her husband has suffered, unfortunately, a random attack and was injured and is now not working. And Leah is finding to her chagrin that it's one thing to be a researcher into the meaning of fear, and it's another to help her husband heal from his own fears. So she comes home in this scene, and it's November, it's cold, and she sees out in the yard that this man is talking to her young son. They've got 2 young kids, and her husband is nowhere in sight. And so she's concerned. So she has approached her son, and I'll pick up from there. Jay, her husband, was nowhere in sight, failing as usual to keep a close eye on the kids. He'd been an attentive parent before the attack. She'd assumed that the incident would make him overly cautious. Jay's healing had the exact opposite effect, although lately his neglect seemed less like something he couldn't control and more like an open revolt against what he'd decided was her hovering over Kurt and Bunny's every move. Maybe he'd just been humoring her fears back when he'd been so careful. She jogged across the lawn. The man motioned her over as if she'd kept him waiting. When she reached her son Kurt, she stroked his head. Her fingers snagged prickers tangled in his hair. Fiery red and gold leaves clung to his back. He'd been traipsing into the ravine at the east end of the house again, no coat, no mittens, and no hat. "Are you okay?" She almost added, "Did this man hurt you?" "He's getting ready to shoot the fawn," Kurt told her. "It's the wrong season for fawns," the man answered Kurt by addressing Leah. Leah removed her coat and draped it over Kurt's shoulders. "Excuse me, who are you?" The man touched his cap. "Wildlife Service, ma'am." The thumb and the forefinger of his hand were lapped to the knuckle. Scars from old burns striped his wrist, glistening in the fading sunlight like strips of cellophane. "What's going on here?" Behind the man, the trailer's metal tailgate yawned open. The bed was loaded with gear, platforms and railings, black canvas straps, yellow winch hooks, yards of loose tweedy rope. A Bowie knife tucked in a leather sheath lay next to a pair of antlers tangled up in a rope. A shotgun with a rusting barrel lay slung on the rope's coils, looking as if it hadn't been fired in years. "I saw her," Kurt pointed to the ravine. "Right down there." Their home's former owners, both in real estate, had maintained the landscaping as meticulously as if the yard were another room to clean, but they'd let the eastern boundary grow wild. Wheatgrass and scrub brush scalloped the lawn's edge like torn lace. Beyond the ravine stretched an abandoned cornfield. Old papery stalks bowed at half-mast, frozen in neat rows. In the middle of a field, a lone cottage hunkered like an aid container dropped far from the need. "Debate site's at the corn." "The corn?" She thought Kurt meant the field. "I don't see a fawn, honey." "Down there, Mom," Kurt jabbed his finger. "I said at the bait site." "The what?" "The bait site, ma'am." The man's clean, straight teeth, creamy, clear skin, his freshly washed and pressed jeans suggested a sound mind and body. But his squinting eyes under the cap's brim were rimmed red, and a sour, musty odor, like a root cellar gone to rot, drifted from his mouth when he spoke. "Who are you again?" Leah demanded. From the depths of his jacket pocket, the man produced a badge ID. Wolverine Wildlife Control Service, Gary Starkey, certified. What he was certified in exactly was left blank. Kurt tugged her hand. "Wildlife means fawns, Mom." "Grown up, dear son, we don't shoot the little ones." "We don't shoot anything. What in the hell is going on here?" When Leah swore, Kurt dropped her hand. A stiff breeze rifled the tall grass, shuddered through the bare tangles of branches, and cut through Leah's blouse. "Setting up for the deer call." The more agitated she grew, the calmer the man seemed. "I don't know anything about this." A fib. Leah knew all right. She'd just forgotten the call began tonight. When she'd learned from the neighborhood association that come late fall, sharpshooters would fill her subdivision's trees, Leah had driven straight to the county office to complain. The information sheet the brisk young woman behind the desk handed her, in response to your inquiry, explained the call as a painless euthanasia. The herd reduction was divided into phases. During the first phase, sharpshooters would target does from safe and supervised bait sites. The maintenance phase that followed lasted a week. Incentives were set for qualified volunteers to harvest at least one doe. More substantial cash rewards were given for the most does culled at the close of the hunt. The culling of bucks, while not prohibited, was discouraged. Controlling the female segment of the population is critically necessary, the sheet noted. A forlorn graphic of a hand-rendered ink outline of a deer, head cocked in caution, a front hoof raised tentatively as if to flee, was printed in the handout's bottom margin. Behind the brisk young county clerk, 2 cops hunched over worn laminate desks strewn with carbon paper, as if the computer sitting blank and idle at another empty desk was a last-ditch resource for true emergencies. The good-looking one with a sculpted build and silky dark hair had glanced up at her briefly when she'd first entered. He had checked her out, dismissed her unimpressive figure cocooned in a loose cable sweater and old jeans, her plain brown hair, her anxious expression. The overweight one, inexplicably wearing teardrop reflective shades indoors, hadn't looked at her at all. As she'd stood staring, first at the handout and then at the clerk's smiling firewall of Midwestern distance, the overweight cop dropped his pen tiredly as if he'd encountered a question he couldn't answer, leaned back in his chair, and tilted his lenses at her. Not overweight, the shift of his body revealed, just big, all muscle. The shades beamed at her in the room's harsh fluorescence. He might have been looking straight at her, or past her dismissively, as the good-looking officer had done. The shades were a masculine parody of her mother's favorite costume, the gigantic 60s-era sunglasses she had used to accessorize her suffering. The lenses reoriented back to the paperwork. For a heavy man, the cop's features, at least what she could detect behind the glasses, were delicate. Rosebud lips, a soft rounded chin, uncombed hair the color of a beer bottle. He sat upon the form as if something in their glancing exchange had answered the question that had stymied him. How he could see anything at all through the dark mirrors shading his eyes stymied her. Her aversion to cops rose in her then, the promise of security that was only for show. She balled her fist. The handout crinkled. This same big cop would show up on her stoop a few weeks later to write up the report after their house was robbed. He would meet her questions about recovering their stuff with condescension, as if she were stupid to wonder if stolen goods might reasonably be sought or even found. The clerk asked whether, after studying the information sheet, she had any more questions. "Yes, I have a question," Leah said. "This all seems very dangerous." The clerk waited patiently for Leah to realize she'd made a statement, not a question. Leah crossed her arms. "I have young children," which was another statement. The shades tilted her way again. The cull took place with close cooperation from the sheriff's office, she was told, and she was also told there had never been an adverse event, and there were community forums where she could provide feedback on the impact on her neighborhood, and if she had any other questions, which she didn't, then all right, have a great day. Leah had left wondering about the young woman's definition of adverse events. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
That was great.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, do you have anything else you would like to add or to share with us?
I'm just really pleased to have had this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Congrats again on your forthcoming books, and thanks for making the time to share with us.
Thank you so much.